afternoon, Cambridge. Hello, Cambridge. Welcome to an interview with the visual artist Molly Blumberg. My name is Shanae Birch, and I am an actor in Boston, in Cambridge, and I'm here essentially just to introduce you to her work. So we just got a little bit of insight into the process for Molly, but let's take it back to where she's from. She lives in Somerville, but how long have you been in Boston or Cambridge, Molly?
I've been in Boston for the last 3 or so years. Moved back after college. I'm originally from the area, but made the pilgrimage back home after graduation.
Oh wow, where did you go to school? Did you study art?
Yeah, I studied art at the Sam Fox School of Design and Visual Arts at Washington University in St. Louis. It was a smaller program that I found. I was really interested in finding a school that had both the visual arts program within a different university and a larger university, so I had access to other types of academics and other peer groups as well.
What influenced you? What inspired you to pursue artistry in college?
I had gone into college knowing that I wanted to major in art. They have a specific art school at Washington University, so I went there originally to become a painting major. And after a few years in the program, really fell in love with sculpture and working in 3D and those types of media, so I made the switch into sculpture and cruised it right along with that.
Oh, wow. So was there a professor or a specific person that maybe assisted you or mentored you in sculpture?
Yeah, I had a professor, Joan Hall, who was a paper maker. Even going into sculpture, I wasn't entirely sure what medium I wanted to work in. And I experimented around for my first year there. I did a lot of installation work. And kind of through happenstance, I needed a really large sheet of paper for a piece I was working on. So my professor showed me how to make paper, and through that process I kind of fell in love with the medium and never really went back from there.
Oh wow. So does your daily experience ever affect your work?
I think it does. I think that a lot of art is kind of synthesizing the world that you're in. You have your daily influences, your daily experiences that you kind of process as an individual. So I think artwork is never, for me personally, like a direct meditation on all of that, but because I am myself experiencing what I do, it kind of comes out through the artwork. Art is kind of that release of all these historical and daily and cultural influences that you accumulate throughout your life.
Speaking about like social and cultural influences, you are a young female artist. So what might that have had in inspiring your work?
Yeah, I think being a female artist, especially working in a traditional medium, is kind of expected of you that your art is directly about being a female artist or a young female in the world. And I think that as that is me, my art is influenced by it, but it's not necessarily a direct comment on that. I think it's impossible to get beyond the fact that I am, a female artist working in paper making, which is a traditional female medium, but I think my work kind of has more kind of larger themes that in some ways reflect upon that. I deal a lot with ideas of regeneration and growth and kind of the nurturing that goes into that, which I guess can also be viewed in a feminist light. But it's never really the direct idea that I'm approaching in my artwork.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what I think you started to speak a little bit on it, but what would you say are the recurring themes in your work?
Yeah, so a lot of my artwork has a lot of natural references. Visually, a lot of the forms that I use reference seeds and growth and plants, marine life, all sorts of different types of growth in colonies. A lot of it references, barnacles and leaves and seeds and anything that kind of grows in clusters and creates these communities that both flourish as a whole, but also kind of set the path for the next generation. So you have seeds that grow plants that are, a form of life, but then in the dying process, they're fertilizing the ground for the next wave of growth. So a lot of my artwork kind of fits right in that cusp of dying and growing and kind of moving in both directions.
Wow. So because your work carries literally so much weight, do you find that it's more important for people to understand the message and be able to pinpoint the themes, or is it more important for the viewer or the person who's engaging with your work to create their own message or create their own understanding?
I think it's a bit of both. I think when you're creating art, you might have your individual story and your individual thoughts that you're putting into the art. But I find that instead of giving it that specific message that the viewer then needs to decode, it's more of, putting in the emotion, putting in the intellect, giving it a general feeling, which then the viewer will then interpret into their own life. So I might have a very specific story that drives me to create a certain piece, but instead of the viewer then looking at it and having to find the clues and decode and find my specific life story, maybe it's just the inherent emotion that they'll pick up on and then bring that into their own life. So what they take away from it might be more of a reflection on their own engagement with the artwork.
So speaking of engagement, what has been the most surprising response to your artwork? You just had an 8-week exhibition at Voltage Cafe, right there in Kendall Square. That could be a point from that or previous exhibitions.
I've had a few kind of surprising responses. I guess
time for all.
We do. I guess originally when I started working in paper, it's kind of a basic response, but something that really surprised me is so many people wanted to come and touch it, which is just a very instinctual response to a piece of art.
Because of all the texture.
Because it's really tactile, it's textural, it's a material that people relate to, but they're seeing it in a new form. And we're so used to being in the art world where, there are art's hanging on the wall, it's behind a glass case, it's kind of removed from your everyday life. So to have a piece that people want to physically engage with is really exciting to me. And although in many gallery settings I can't allow people to, it's really great when I do have that moment where someone asks if they can touch it and I have an extra piece or there's something that they can really engage with, because I think that moment of surprise and that moment of just delight and being able to really physically engage a piece of artwork removes it, kind of dissolves that barrier between the viewer and the art, and they get to really experience it on a basic level and take themselves into it.
That's really cool. I mean, we got a glimpse into the process of you creating in the video that we opened up with. Have you ever ventured into public or performance artwork where maybe the viewer is able to engage and participate with you?
I haven't done much. I also work with handmade books.
Okay.
And it's fun because papermaking is so easily incorporated into that. And the closest I've ever gotten to really performance art is I made a series of handmade books where the paper was still wet so that people could come read the book, but they're still handling these wet pieces of paper. And what's really fascinating about the types of fibers I work with is that it's a really active medium. So as it dries, it's shrinking and it's contorting. So if people are interacting with the sheets, the way they're moving it affects how it will dry. So this book was literally like a solid, as soon as it dried, like a solid, like a relic of the entire process of what had gone into, the exhibition.
Oh,
yeah.
Super cool.
Yeah.
Perhaps we can take a little bit more looks at your
Yeah, let's take a look.
Take a look.
So we'll start back with some pieces that were done when I was in college. This was my oops, sorry about that, some technical issues with this computer. This piece was actually my thesis piece in college.
Okay.
So the good part of my senior year went into making this, and it's titled "To Quicken Trees into Life," which is a quote taken from Virginia Woolf. And this piece was really important to me, and I didn't really realize all that went into it as I was making it. I'm really process driven, so I was so focused on the paper making, and each of those individual bulbs that you can see hanging is made from stockings that were filled with corn kernels and dipped into pulp and dried and kind of torn apart and then strung together. And I was so involved in that process that then I took a step back and realized how much it was about, presenting growth, and how this piece to me reminded me of roots of trees and seed pods. And again, going back into my themes of, this piece, because it's so vertically oriented, has that weight of dropping but also growing at the same time. So it really felt to me like a transitional piece in life where, you're not to be too metaphorical, but dropping the seeds for the future and kind of planting that. So that is that piece. We can move on. Oh, these are actually the first pieces of paper I made. That they are a series of 4 pieces of 8-foot by 5-foot pieces of paper that were made using a compression sprayer and paper fiber and charcoal. So as each layer was sprayed, it makes a really, really thin, like even thinner than tissue paper layer, and then layering in the charcoal between each layer. So each piece was probably about 7 layers of charcoal, and it was really an active experiment to me, because as the paper's wet, you're adding the pigment and the material, and that's leaving a really literal mark of your interaction. So it's kind of, in some ways, can read as destructive by, dropping these pigments in and kind of having them, parts of the paper, it's hard to see in these images, literally kind of explode because of how the pigment's been dropped into it. But it also leaves that really wonderful mark of growth and kind of organic expansion. So those are those pieces. Here's another view of them. This is actually a current exhibition up at Bantam Cider in Union Square in Somerville. This is really exciting for me because these pieces have lived in a basement for so long, and I finally found somewhere that was big enough to display them. So it's exciting for me at this point in my career to be able to revisit them. So they'll be up for a while if anyone wants to go grab themselves a cider and take a look.
Cider.
Yes. Let's see. And this is another piece that was the same process, bringing in some more pigments. It's a slightly smaller piece of paper. It ended up being a lot thicker. I worked with this one a little longer than I'd intended to, so by the time it formed, it was a really rigid, solid piece. But again, working with those themes of growth, this one is, it's interesting to me. I don't always bring in multiple pigments, and I think it reads differently than my other piece. It's less light, not so much about that kind of ephemeral growth, but I like it as well.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So.
Well, thank you so much for
we'll
sharing.
visit some more in a little later.
Yeah, of course.
Yes.
You show us when you're ready. And we won't push or press. I know what it feels like to be put on the spot. Sinead, do a monologue. No.
Oh, yes.
Of course. All right, so let's talk more just about your day-to-day experience again.
Mm-hmm.
We live in a city where the first thing that people ask you once they meet you is, what do you do? Why are you here?
Mm-hmm.
What is your general response, and how do people react?
That's a fun one because living in the Boston area, you don't say you work at MGH and people are really thrown off. You're not in research and they don't know what to say. I usually just like to answer and say I'm an artist and kind of see where that conversation goes. I think some people are really excited and receptive to that and will press that further, but then it also kind of wards off the people who are inherently judgmental and against the arts. They'll usually just kind of end that conversation right there. But I do like to lead in with, just being an artist. Although I sometimes feel like that's cheating as a profession because I think it's hard to, remove that just from your existence. As an artist, you're always engaging. You're not an artist from 9 to 5 and then you go home and you're,
not an artist.
Right, not an artist. Which I'm sure you know as well, working through theater, you're always an artist. But I really do like to talk with people who are so used to the more traditional types of professions and explain to them what I do and how it is to be a young artist, because it's not a traditional path. And you know, a lot of extra work goes into creating that life for yourself.
Yeah.
But it's great, and I found that a lot of people really are open and receptive to learning more about the arts in Boston.
Cool.
Yeah.
So wait, take us through your day then. You are creating your own art. Sometimes it's being commissioned for you. But what's the day-to-day like?
What's the day-to-day? Well, the day-to-day depends on the day, which is also a great question. Continuing on with the professional conversation, I also am a teaching artist in an arts immersion program for at-risk youth. So I get to, you know, take my artistic voice and bring it to kids and let them bring it back to me, sometimes in a whole different light. And it's a really rewarding process. So that sometimes is, you know, my day-to-day is going to an actual job and working with kids and creating art. In my studio, my day-to-day really also depends on where I'm at with a piece. I'm, again, really process-driven, so a lot of the time, like, I feel like 90% of making a piece is just, for me, that the labor that goes into creating, you know, all these repeated forms and making the sheets of paper like you saw in the video and casting them either around the bowls or setting them up to dry in certain ways. So I can spend weeks of just like on the assembly line making my own paper. And then the exciting part comes in when I'm getting ready to finish it up and it like all just kind of snaps together. I get to put it all on the floor and, you know, grab the other materials I love working with. I like using reclaimed wood and rope and just all of a sudden, you know, putting it together. And so I can spend a month, you know, getting myself ready to finish a piece and finish it in like 3 hours. And it's kind of a great, it's
wow.
It's great.
So wait, let's go back to you being a teaching artist.
Yes.
How old are these students, and what is the reward for them? Like what have you seen like?
So
their engagement.
Our students are a whole range of ages. They're technically from 5 to 23, although we have kids that tend to span either edge of that. A lot of the kids who come to my program come through the Department of Mental Health, and this program has been in existence for 22 years now.
Wow.
It's a really great, long-standing nonprofit that's up in Beverly, Massachusetts. It's called Express Yourself. And it's really rewarding because I think so oftentimes, like, kids who are either in treatment or even just in a school setting are given a really specific set of tasks where they're you know, learning a subject to spit it back out, or kids who are in treatment for various types of issues are engaging with adults who are trying to fix them and trying to get to the root, which, you know, is a very important thing. But it's rewarding to create an environment for them where they really just get to be expressive and they get to learn something new and exciting and creative and make what they will of it. We don't generally like prescribe a finished product, although it all does accumulate in like a huge stage performance, which is really fantastic. And
at the Wang?
At the Wang Theater, yes. So every May at the Wang Theater, we put on our end of the year performance with our kids, and it features all the artwork that they've been working so hard on, and we bring in performing artists to work with them. We have Stomp, and Blumberg Group has worked, so they get the professional theater experience as well. And I think the most rewarding part of it is to really see how they have this great sense of self at the end of it. You know, they have such ownership over what they've created, and they've been able to grow as people just through the arts. You know, it's not art therapy in the sense that we're addressing specific issues through art and using it in a therapeutic medium, but they're just experiencing the arts and they're creating in groups, and through that they're growing social skills, growing personal skills, and they come out just kind of a better sense of self and, you know, generally a more, you know, self-affirmed person.
That's so awesome. Yeah. I think we've talked to you about this just a little bit, but how there are some people who are like, I'm definitely creative, and then there are others who may be out here watching right now who are like, I'm totally not creative. And the other day, last weekend, my pastor was preaching, and he said something like an aside to the people who would identify as non-creative. And I was questioning to a friend who's also a graphic designer, like, what is the opposite of creative? Like, you can't just say non-creative. What's the opposite word? And so we went to the Google, and Google said that the opposite word of creative is destructive. And I'm curious if more people knew that, right? If they took the literal antonym, like would they be more encouraged to consider themselves creative? Like, what do you think What would you say to someone who maybe thinks that they're not creative?
I think that's actually a really great response, because I think we're so, in our society, we're kind of just, you're brought up to label yourself, and, through school you put yourself in boxes. Like, at some point I decided I wasn't good at math, and I tell people I'm not good at math.
Wow.
But, it's not that easy. There are parts of different, academics that everyone can relate to and everyone can thrive with, and if we, instead of dividing them, understood them as, one giant realm of intellect and understanding, I think a lot more people would be receptive to defining themselves differently. And I think creativity is one of those buzzwords where people like to either, describe themselves as not creative if they're not in the arts, if they're not, in a startup creating something new. And I think creativity comes in so many different forms, just getting dressed in the morning, you're making choices. I think life is just a series of creative choices. And if we stopped labeling creativity as just art, I think a lot more people would be open to exploring their creativity.
Absolutely. As far as balancing goes, right? Balancing your work life, your social life, the work that's being commissioned for you, what have you. Thinking about how you do it, what would you say to a young artist, a young promising artist?
There are a few pieces of advice that were given to me that I still try to follow as much as I can.
Share with us.
So the first one that was actually told to me as I was graduating was to not try to go out and originally be a professional artist, which is a surprising piece of advice, but I think the core of it is, if you go out with the intention of creating art that's going to sell, you kind of pigeonhole yourself creatively into this corner where you're trying to figure out what the market wants. And it might not be your voice. I was working really large scale for a while, which isn't necessarily, easily sellable and easily displayable, but I think you really have to stick true to your voice. And if you're creating artwork that is important to you and that is aesthetically exciting to you, people are going to respond to it, and you'll find your niche. So I think going out and not trying to, support yourself by selling your artwork immediately is an important thing to do. I think the other thing is, like we had talked about, you have to balance so much in your life and creating time for your artwork. There are days where I go to my studio and I'm not feeling it, and I'll just sit there and I might, read a book for a little while and, putz around, organize things, move things around, put them back, make a mess. And while I might not have a very productive day artistically, I think you have to give yourself that time and your space, because even the days where I go in not feeling it and not thinking that I'm going to make anything, I might reflect on that day a week later and realize there was something in there that, created a spark. So you do have to have the discipline, and you can't just, go in once a month because you're feeling creative and expect yourself to make great pieces of art. I think that's another really great misconception that people have of artists, that you're just constantly inspired, or that you're only creating when the spirit of art is flowing through you. And it's it's work and dedication, and you just have to put yourself in the position to find it.
Wow. Going back to the first words of advice, not creating to sell. We live in a world where, you need money to pay rent. You need money to feed you or your family or what have you, to get across town if you don't, even to get a bike, right? You're not even doing public transportation. So
I know.
What would you say is the sacrifice or surrender in that?
There is, and I know we've discussed this too with your work as an actor, that you're not making a ton of money, and you do have to pay rent. The sacrifice to me comes into, sometimes I'm just I'm really tired sometimes, or I don't get into my studio as much as I'd like. If I'm teaching 4 or 5 days a week, I might only get in on the weekends, which is, not as much as I'd ideally like to be in there. And I think sometimes the sacrifices are little too. It might just be that I've decided that on a Sunday, instead of sleeping in and going to brunch, that I'm getting up and going to the studio. But I think it's all rewarding enough for me that it balances.
Yeah.
And you're right, it is hard. You do have to make money and pay rent, which is the sad part of life sometimes.
But things are provided for,
yes,
right? In the surprising sort of way. The last question I really have for you is, what's next? You've been so generous with all this information about you and learning just about your craft and your why. How can we how can we keep track with you?
Yeah, so I'll throw on some more slides here of some of my newer artwork. This is from the last few years. Some of these forms you might recognize from the video, but what's next? It's always kind of changing. I'm discovering a new process. I actually have a piece right now that I'm working on that I don't have images of, but is more about letting the paper dry itself how it will, which is exciting. When you're working with paper, it'll shrink to whatever form you create. So a lot of these, like this piece, a lot of my beginning pieces were creating armatures that the paper then dried around, and I'm now working more by letting it dry freely and kind of shrinking and growing in its own dimensions. And as far as where you can find my work, I do have a website. It's www.mollyblumberg.com, which I'm not as good about updating as I should be, but hopefully I'll get better about that. And hopefully I'll be displaying more of my artwork in the world.
Yeah.
But we'll see. I've been working larger as well, which, as I had said before, is not always the easiest to get out in the world. But something exciting that I've been doing is making some really large-scale pieces, and then really quickly making a smaller, kind of not necessarily just a smaller version, but taking this really large process and boiling it down to a day and seeing what I can do with the leftovers. All right. So we have just a few more minutes on here, so I will get through the rest of these slides.
Yeah,
we'll just throw a few up here.
Thank you so much, Molly, for having us here. Again, you can find Molly at www.mollyblumberg.com, MOLLYBLUMBERG.com. We're so excited to have her here, but also for you to engage with her and the art. It's so exciting to be a local young artist in this city, and we're looking forward to what the Cambridge Arts Council does for us and what we're able to do for the city in reclaiming art.
Yes, and Shanae, thank you so much for being here with me. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
Absolutely, so much fun. Anything for friends.